A creek in the middle of American farm country runs black from bank to bank for miles. Men in white suits stand along it, and the worst part is what they already know. A lot of the oil isn't up on the surface where they can skim it. It is sunk. It's down on the bottom now, in the mud, where their booms and their machines can't reach it, and it's going to stay there, somewhere under a field of corn, buried, out of sight. A river of oil the consistency of cold asphalt is being pushed south under pressure. It runs directly over the water that a quarter of this country's crops drink from. On a lawn near the White House, a rancher in a cowboy hat and a Lakota man in a feathered headdress stand in the same line, on the same side, for the first time in 150 years. And in a field somewhere, sections of steel pipe as tall as a man lie rusting in the grass, bought, paid for, going nowhere. The bones of a $9 billion project that was never finished. One name ties all of it together: Keystone. You saw it in the news for a decade. A word inside an argument you were probably tired of. You never really saw what it was. This channel has followed the water twice now. The water we control. The water that controls us. This is the third river, the one we buried. So here's the question worth the next half hour of your life. What is actually flowing under the American heartland, and what happens on the day it gets out? Why did one buried pipe make allies out of enemies who had been fighting each other for a century and a half? And how did the most fought-over pipeline in the history of the country end its life as steel rusting in a field? By the end of this video, you'll drive over that ground knowing what's under your wheels and knowing what both sides paid for it. Start with the water, because almost nobody does. Under the Great Plains, under 8 states, from South Dakota down to Texas, lies one of the largest bodies of fresh water on Earth, and it's underground. It's called the Ogallala, part of what geologists name the High Plains Aquifer, and the size of it is hard to feel. According to the U.S. Geological Survey, it holds something on the order of 1 quadrillion gallons of water. Enough, if you could spread it out on the surface, to cover all 50 states more than a foot deep. It isn't a lake, and it isn't a river. It's water soaked into sand and gravel, sitting in the dark under the corn, and most of it has been down there since the last ice age. That water is the reason the middle of the country is green. Roughly a third of all the groundwater used to irrigate crops in the United States is pumped up out of the Ogallala. The grain and the beef of a huge share of the country grow on top of it, and most of the people who live out there drink it straight from the ground. Pull the Ogallala out from under the plains, and the plains go back to being a desert. And here's the part that raises the stakes on everything else. The Ogallala barely refills. Most of that water soaked in slowly over thousands of years, back when this land was wetter. And across much of the aquifer, the rain that falls today replaces only a trickle of what the pumps pull out. It's closer to a savings account than a running river, one that took an ice age to fill and can be spent only once. Poison a stretch of it, and you're not waiting a season for it to run clean. You could be waiting longer than the country has been a country, and it's already draining. Researchers at Kansas State University, who have studied the aquifer for years, projected that if the pumping keeps up at its current pace, a large share of the water under Kansas could be gone within this century. So the plains are already living on a one-time inheritance they're spending faster than it comes back. Threading a river of oil straight through the middle of that was never going to be a quiet proposition, and the people who farm on top of it understood the math better than anyone. Now draw a line across it. The pipeline the company wanted to build, the Keystone Extra Large, was planned to run from the tar sands of Canada down toward the Gulf of Mexico, and the path they drew took it straight across the top of that aquifer. It ran through a stretch of Nebraska called the Sandhills, 100 miles of thin, grassy dunes sitting right on top of the water, where the ground is so porous that rain disappears into it in minutes. After years of protest, the company agreed to move the route. But move it where? In parts of the new path, the water sits so close to the surface that the buried pipe wouldn't have run over the aquifer at all. It would have run inside it, steel and oil threaded directly through the water people drink. Stand in a field out there, and there are two rivers under your boots. One is the water, clean, ancient, the thing that quietly feeds a continent. The other is the one we put in on purpose, a few feet down, carrying something very different. To understand why thousands of farmers who had never held a protest sign in their lives suddenly lay down in the dirt in front of the bulldozers, you have to know what is actually moving through that pipe. Because it is not the oil you're picturing. And if it ever got loose down here, no one could get it back. The oil in that pipe doesn't come from a well the way you imagine a well. It's dug out of the ground. Up in the north of Alberta, the forest has been scraped off, and the earth underneath is being mined in open pits deeper than a 20-story building is tall. What they're digging is called tar sand, or oil sand, and it's exactly what it sounds like. Sand soaked through with a black, tarry petroleum called bitumen. Bitumen is not a liquid in any way you'd recognize. At room temperature, it's about as runny as a hockey puck. Trucks the size of houses haul away hundreds of thousands of tons of this sand every single day, and the waste ponds left behind are so enormous they can be seen from orbit. Among the largest man-made things on the planet, sitting right beside a major river. To reach the sand, an area of northern forest bigger than some cities has been stripped down to bare ground. The ponds of leftover sludge hold enough toxic residue that the companies fire propane cannons across them around the clock to frighten off migrating birds, because the ones that land on that water tend not to fly off again. This is the front end of the pipe, the place the oil is born. 1,000 miles and a whole country away from a cornfield in Nebraska. You cannot push a hockey puck through a pipeline, so to move it, the bitumen is cut with a cocktail of lighter chemicals until it's thin enough to flow. The result is called diluted bitumen, Dilbit for short, and while it's running down the pipe, it behaves more or less like any other crude. The trouble is what it does when it escapes. When ordinary crude oil spills into water, it floats. That's bad, but it's a bad you can work with. You can corral it, skim it, burn it off the top. Diluted bitumen does something else. Once it's out in the open, the light chemicals that were keeping it liquid evaporate off into the air, and what's left behind is the heavy bitumen, and the heavy bitumen sinks. It drops down through the water and settles into the mud on the bottom, and there is no clean way to get it back out. We know exactly what that looks like, because it has already happened once, on a different pipeline. In 2010, a line run by another company, Enbridge, not the operator of Keystone, ruptured and poured diluted bitumen into a creek that fed the Kalamazoo River in Michigan. Everyone assumed it would be a normal oil spill. It was not. For something like 17 hours after the pipe split open, the company's control room misread its own alarms and kept the oil pumping. And by the time anyone grasped what had happened, the bitumen had already sunk to the river bottom and mixed into the mud. Crews spent years dredging a river to chase oil that refused to float. The National Transportation Safety Board, the federal agency that investigates these disasters, later called it the most expensive onshore oil cleanup in American history. That is the kind of oil the Keystone system was built to carry across the water under the corn. And here I owe the oil's defenders a fair hearing, because on one point, they're right. A panel convened by the National Academy of Sciences studied diluted bitumen and found no evidence that it's any more likely than ordinary crude to corrode a pipeline or spring a leak in the first place. The danger, the panel stressed, isn't that this oil escapes more often than any other. It's what it does once it's out. It sinks, and it stays. The company that wanted to run that oil across the heartland had an answer for all of it. They promised this would be one of the safest pipelines ever built, watched every second, shut down at the first hint of trouble. A few years later, a single field in Kansas showed what that promise was worth. Before we get to that Kansas field, one quick thing. If the idea of an invisible river running a few feet under your boots is getting to you, subscribe. This channel goes to the places the tour guides drive around. Now, the spill. In December of 2022, in Washington County, Kansas, the ground gave the first sign of trouble the way it usually does, a smell. What had opened up under that farmland was the Keystone pipeline, the one that actually got built and had been running heavy Canadian crude for years. Before anyone could shut it down, something like 14,000 barrels of that oil, close to 500,000 gallons, poured out into a waterway called Mill Creek. According to federal data, it was the largest onshore crude oil spill in the United States in 9 years, and it was bigger than every previous spill on the entire Keystone system combined. The pictures are hard to look at. Oil standing an inch thick, bank to bank, running 3.5 miles down the creek. More than 2,000 animals killed or coated in it. It happened in December, in the cold, which thickened the oil and, in a small mercy, kept it from carrying even farther, and crews were still hauling oiled earth out of the banks by the truckload months later. The cleanup would climb toward $500 million. And 3 years on, the company reached a settlement with the Environmental Protection Agency and the Justice Department of around $70 million. And this was the pipeline whose entire selling point had been safety, monitored, modern, the best ever built. It also wasn't the first time. According to a review by the Government Accountability Office, the investigative arm of Congress, the Keystone system leaked more than 20 times in its first decade, spilling over 1 million gallons of oil in total. The Kansas rupture was the system's third major spill in 5 years. A few years before it, in 2017, the same pipeline dumped thousands of barrels onto a farm in Amherst, South Dakota. And when investigators went looking for the cause, they traced it to a crack that had been sitting in the steel since the day it was installed. A flaw built into the pipe, waiting years to open. There was also something unusual about how hard this particular pipe was allowed to run. The Federal Pipeline Regulator, an agency called Pipeline and Hazardous Materials Safety Administration, had granted Keystone a rare special permit to operate at higher internal pressure than the standard rules normally allow. After the Kansas break, that same agency ordered the pressure cut and opened a review of the permit, although its own investigators found the section that failed had not actually been running above the ordinary limit. What they found at the rupture was a crack in a bend of the pipe. It's the kind of detail that captures the whole problem. The rules can be followed, the permits can be in order, and the steel can still let go. There's a hard truth buried in the engineering here. A pipeline is thousands of miles of steel, welded together by human hands and buried where no one can watch it, carrying hot, heavy, gritty crude under pressure. And steel like that does not last forever. The honest question was never really whether it would leak. It was where and onto what. And remember, all of this is the pipeline that got built and worked. There was a second one, the extra large, meant to run beside it, and that one never went into the ground at all because it raised up against itself an alliance this land had not seen in 150 years. The ground the new pipeline wanted to cross was not empty ground. It had been promised away before, and the people it was promised to were still there. Long before the farms, this was Lakota country, guaranteed to the Sioux nations in writing by the Fort Laramie treaties of the 1850s and 60s, agreements the United States signed and then, as the years passed and the land turned valuable, mostly broke. The extra-large route ran straight through country the Lakota had never stopped holding to be theirs by law. And laid over that same land were the ranches and farms of families who had worked the soil for generations, and who now opened their mail to find letters informing them that a foreign company intended to run a pipe across their property whether they liked it or not, using a legal power called eminent domain to take the strip of land if they refused to sell. So the pipeline did something almost nobody predicted. It put the Cowboys and the Indians on the same side. ranchers whose great-grandparents had fought the Sioux, and Lakota, whose great-grandparents had fought the settlers, found themselves at the same table, bent over the same maps, frightened for the same water. They called themselves, without irony, the Cowboy and Indian Alliance. In the spring of 2014, they went to Washington together and pitched a camp of teepees on the National Mall, within sight of the Capitol, a rancher's hat and a war bonnet in the same photograph. And they named the protest Reject and Protect. The Rosebud Sioux started a campaign of their own with a name that said all of it, Shield the People, and set up camps along the route. People whose families had spent the 1800s trying to destroy each other spent the 2010s defending the same aquifer, standing between the bulldozers and the water. That is what this pipe did. It found the one thing neither of them would agree to lose, and it lined them up shoulder to shoulder over it. In Nebraska, they got literal about standing in the way. A group called Bold Nebraska helped landowners plant a field of sacred ponca corn directly in the pipeline's path. Along the route of a forced march, the ponca had been driven down in the 1870s, and they raised a barn out of reclaimed wood and set solar panels on the right-of-way, daring the company to bulldoze crops, a building, and a tribe's history to lay its pipe. It looked like theater. It was also law, a thicket of obligations the company would have to clear, and it helped run out the clock year after year. Some of those ranchers had spent their whole lives wary of environmentalists and tribal activists alike, and now they were hosting them for supper and standing beside them in the dirt. And what took shape along the Keystone route helped rehearse a larger confrontation a couple of years later, when thousands gathered at Standing Rock over a different pipeline and a different river. The heartland had discovered that the people it could turn out to defend its water did not fit anyone's tidy picture of a protester. That alliance, and the lawsuits and the protests that rode along with it, turned a single pipeline into the most fought-over piece of construction in the modern history of the country. For 12 years, 3 presidents passed it back and forth between them. How it ended, and whether it was worth it, depends entirely on who you ask. For more than a decade, the Keystone Extra Large was less a construction project than a political football. President Obama studied it for years and finally rejected it in 2015, arguing that a pipeline built to carry some of the most carbon-heavy oil on Earth was the wrong bet for a country trying to cut its emissions. 2 years later, President Trump reversed him with a stroke of a pen, calling it thousands of jobs and a matter of national strength, and the project began to move again. Then, on his first day in office in 2021, President Biden revoked the permit once more. This time, the company let go. After pouring billions into a project it could no longer see a future for, TransCanada Energy canceled the Keystone XL, wrote off around $2.5 billion, and later filed a claim under the trade agreement that replaced North American Free Trade Agreement, seeking to recover more than $15 billion from the United States government over the reversal. And here I owe you the other side of the table, because it's a real one. The people who wanted this pipeline were not cartoon villains. They argued correctly that the oil was going to be dug up and burned whether or not this particular pipe existed, and that if it didn't travel by pipeline, it would travel by rail, in tanker cars rolling through the middle of American towns. And they had a grim example to point at. In 2013, a runaway train loaded with crude oil derailed and exploded in the town of Lac-Mégantic, just over the border in Quebec, and killed 47 people in a single night. Pipelines, supporters said, are the quieter, steadier, statistically safer way to move a thing the country was going to burn anyway. They pointed to the jobs, thousands of them during construction. Their opponents pointed out that once the pipe was finished, running it took almost no one. The State Department's own review put the permanent workforce at about 35 people. Both of those numbers are true at the same time. That is what made the fight so hard and so long. So who won? In the narrow sense, the people who didn't want the XL, it was never finished. In some fields along the route, the pipe that had already been laid out was pulled back up, and steel meant to carry oil to the Gulf was sold off or left to rust in the grass. A ghost of a pipeline marking a line across the plains that oil never flowed through. But step back, and the victory gets complicated. And this is where the whole story turns. The XL was stopped. The oil was not. The original Keystone pipeline is still there, still pushing heavy Canadian crude under the corn and the aquifer every day, still springing a leak every so often, including into that creek in Kansas. And beyond it, under the whole country, runs something most people never picture at all. According to the federal pipeline regulator, the United States sits on top of roughly 2.5 million miles of oil and gas pipeline. 2.5 million miles, mostly buried, mostly silent, threaded under farms and rivers and playgrounds and the street where you live. Keystone became famous not because it was strange, but because, for a few years, it forced people to look at what is normally invisible. That's the real reason to tell this story. We have followed the water 3 times now. The water at Niagara that we turned into a switch we can flip. The water of the Mississippi that we don't manage so much as negotiate with. And this, the third river, the one we dug out of the ground on another continent and pushed out of sight beneath the water that feeds our own. 2 of those rivers you can stand beside and photograph. The third one you drive over without a thought. A few feet of soil between your tires and a current of something that sinks when it spills and cannot be called back. The pipeline you argued about on the news was never really the question. The question is whether we're willing to know what runs under our own ground and what it costs to hold it there. Keystone made us look, for a few years, at one line out of 2.5 million miles. Then the cameras left, and the rest of it went back to being invisible. It's still down there. It always was. If this changed the way you see the ground under your own feet, leave a like. And tell me in the comments which part hit hardest. The water hiding under the corn, the oil that sinks instead of floats, the Black Creek in Kansas, the Cowboys and the Lakota standing in the same line, or the pipeline left rusting in a field. And tell me honestly which side of this one you land on. Both sides are welcome here. If you want me to go deeper on one of them next, the Ogallala, the Alberta tar sands, or the Kalamazoo spill, say so and subscribe. Because this channel keeps going to the places the map leaves blank. The river is still down there. It always was.